talking until you get me. Paul always wants me to turn the volume down. I blast him out. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you this morning. Let's see. Open your Bibles up to Acts chapter 21. We'll finish 21 this morning and get into chapter 22. Before we get started this morning, let's ask, Sean Silva, would you lead us in an opening prayer, please? Amen. Thank you. All right, we've gotten into that portion of the book of Acts where Paul is about to be arrested. And then the rest of the book really is all the events that take place in his life after that. And there's a series of trials that Paul ends up going through. And he ends up talking about his story and talking about his conversion quite a few times. And I don't know, you could divide Acts up into so many different ways, but for me, the first few chapters, you think about the book of Acts, you start off with Jesus, still on this earth, still on the scene, giving his apostles some final instructions about what he wants them to do. And then we see the beginning of the church, and we get an awful lot of information about the organization of the church, the gospel itself, how it's preached, how people are to respond to the gospel. And then we get into sort of Paul's life, and we see Paul on all these pretty epic journeys, spreading the gospel, establishing churches, establishing elderships, coming back into those same areas and building the brethren up, making sure that they're staying on the right path. These are all these lessons that we see. That's why Acts is so important. It gives us such a great history of the gospel and the beginning of the church. And now, we're at the end of the book right here, as we go into sort of Paul's fourth and final journey. To me, sort of the biggest lessons that we learn, I think, are lessons in attitude about how Paul looks at his own circumstances and how no matter what is going on in his life, he just continues to preach the gospel and to convert people around him. Now, he's done this his whole life. It's true, right? The guy's thrown in jail in Philippi and he converts the jailer, right? So Paul's always done this. But at the end, for me, it's like the lessons that we could get out of it, I think that are most important for us, are just watching Paul's attitude in how he deals with all these circumstances. If we were thrown into these circumstances, what would we do? What would we think? What would we feel like? So many people would just crumble under these kinds of circumstances and think how unfair, how unbelievable these things are. And I'm sure Paul had those thoughts too. But, man, to just see him just plow forward, the guy is like a force of nature. And you just can't stop him. And it's really impressive to think about Paul in those terms and to think about the determination that he has to serve God. And so watch for those kinds of topics. Watch for those kinds of thoughts as we finish the book. And we also see something that has struck me is Paul is always one that wants to stand up and give his own defense. He wants to do it because he always turns it into a sermon. He always turns it into a preaching moment to where he's really trying to convert his brethren or Felix or Festus or Agrippa. It doesn't matter who his audience is. He is coming at them with the truth and with the gospel. It's as if, it's not as if, this is what it is. He knows something and nobody else does. That's how he seems to look at life. He knows something about the truth and about reality and about God. And everyone that he's speaking to just either they're ignoring it or they're ignorant of it. And he just comes at them because he's trying to save their souls. And it's pretty inspiring to watch Paul operate in this manner. And he's been like this all along. How many times can you think, when you go back into your memory banks and you think of him at certain cities where there was a riot and there was a crowd and he wanted to go out and speak to them and his brethren would hold him back. Like, no, you're not going into that arena. I mean, you see that personality trait continue in these moments right here. So anyways, last week we covered this idea that when he was determined to get back to Jerusalem, as Scott pointed out last week, he had gathered funds from all over Asia and he was bringing them back to the saints at Jerusalem. He wanted to be there for the day of Pentecost. He was determined to be there at this time. All of his friends, everyone that loved him, begged him not to go. They all knew there was going to be trouble. They all knew he could be arrested and worse. Paul didn't care. He just kept coming. And so, of course, we get to Jerusalem, and we talked about last week, when he got there, the elders at Jerusalem suggested, hey, do this. Here's the accusation against you. People are making these kinds of accusations against you, like you want to forsake Moses. You don't want anyone to be circumcised anymore. You want to avoid all these Hebrew customs. They were all false accusations. That's not precisely what Paul is teaching. And so we went through all of these things, all of these ideas right here. The accusations were all totally false. Paul really is just teaching to obey Christ, to be circumcised of the heart, and to follow the ways of Christ. That's really what Paul is teaching. And his ability to go into the temple and to do different customs, Hebrew customs, that was his liberty to do that. And so the elders suggested, you do this, and maybe the heat from these Jewish brethren would lessen a little bit. Maybe their hatred of you will subside just a little bit. He's not compromising the gospel. He's not compromising his beliefs. He's not being hypocritical. He's just exercising his liberties, trying not to be killed. And we see the elders were just giving him some advice. And so we're going to read quite a bit today, and we're going to start off. We're going to start off in verse 27. And so, anyways, look at verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and these were the men that the elders suggested. They had 4 men who were under a vow, and they suggested, Paul, take them to the temple. They're going to offer sacrifices. The time for their vow is over, right? So take them to the temple and engage in some of these things with these men. And in verse 26 it says, Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself, along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification, until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. When I first read that, I thought maybe there was a sacrifice offered for Paul as well. But when you read it like that, that's not a necessary conclusion. There may have been a sacrifice offered for the 4 men that were engaged in this vow. And Paul was simply with them. It appears that he paid for this. But did Paul have a sacrifice offered for him? You can't prove it from this reading. I don't know. But if anyone wants to debate about that, go for it. Then let's get to verse 27. And this is where Paul is actually taken. So let's see. Paul Nerlin, would you read for us? Let me see. Read verses 27 down. Well, just read 27 through 30 right now. Then I'll probably have you finish that paragraph as well. Go ahead. Okay. Well, the plan to try to keep the heat off of Paul did not work, did it? And you notice that it's Jews from Asia. So we're talking, well, I took the map down, but we're talking up there, I don't know, all those areas, Derbe, Lystra, places like that, where Paul had all kinds of issues, all kinds of trouble up in those areas. Most of those cities, he was run out of those cities. Some of them, one of them, he was stoned, he was beaten. I mean, he had some real trouble up in Asia. And these men had all come back for the Pentecost. They saw Paul, and they start hurling the accusations. Now, is there a truthful accusation in the reading that we just made? There were several. Look at verse 28. It says, Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and against the law and against this place. They're in the temple. Now, is Paul running around preaching against the Jews? Against the law? Against the temple? No, all false accusations again. There was another accusation. If you keep reading, verse 29. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So he was just seen with a Greek person, and they supposed that he brought him in. So all these accusations are false, and, it's just, we've also seen a pattern where Paul gets in some of these cities. You got a handful of people that just stir the place up. And it's amazing how people flock to that, isn't it? Now here we are in Jerusalem. And we've got a certain group of people saying, Men of Israel, come to our aid. They throw false accusations out. And look at verse 30. Then all the city was provoked. And the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Wouldn't you love to just have control over people like that? Just shout a couple ridiculous accusations, and just get the whole place just to come right to you, and just attack. You got to wonder, do they know what they're attacking for? Other than these accusations? Man. There are professions dedicated to trying to figure out how to control and manipulate people by the masses. Boy, they've got it figured out. The internet could take some lessons, I guess. It really is astounding when we see people just sort of line up like sheep and follow a lunatic. It's been going on forever. Go ahead. Yeah. 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 I mean, we see it today in our own country. We see people just get whipped up into a frenzy. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this is one reason why they don't like Christians very much. We're not given to that kind of thought process and that behavior. We sure shouldn't be. We have something completely different that we follow, and they don't like it. They can't control us. We're controlled by God, not by, I don't know, idealistic thoughts and things like that. Go ahead, O.C. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. That's exactly right. Making sure that the number one influence in our life is God. Not all these other crazy thoughts and ideas. But no, I think that's exactly right. Okay, let's keep going. Let's see. Paul, keep reading for me. Read 31 through 36. Okay. Now, I mean, there's a couple spots in there that sort of indicates the level of violence that is taking place, right? I mean, when they first seize Paul, they drag him into some area, they close the doors, and when you look at verse 31, they were seeking to kill him. They were beating him. And the Roman commander heard about this and rushed in. And we'll see from this reading and from future chapters that he came in there with some force. And he had to, with force, get a hold of Paul and get him out of this situation. I mean, this mob, they're out of control. And let's see, verse 33 says, the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And they began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. So the commander could not figure out, he couldn't ascertain what is going on. Why are you guys about to beat this man to death? So he grabs him, gets a hold of him, binds him up in chains. And then when you look at verse 35, that's pretty astounding. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. Could you imagine seeing that? I mean, Paul's been picked up by a bunch of soldiers, and they're carrying him out of there, and the mob's just clawing at him, evidently. Just coming at him. It's just a completely out of control scene. For what reason? Man. All for false accusations. Okay. Verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek?" Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city. And I beg you, allow me to speak to the people. So we see this again, Paul. He wants to make his defense. He wants to speak to the people. Does Paul think that he can come out there and talk to this crowd and make a difference and calm them down? An unfair question, maybe. I'm asking you what's in Paul's head. But to me, it looks like it does. Like he thinks, just let me talk to him. I've got something to say. Go ahead. That could be too. Yeah. That's like a more realistic thought, isn't it? I mean, in my mind anyways. But this is a characteristic of Paul. He always wants to get out there and talk to these crowds. And so he's going to do that. And let's see. Let's see. I think I stopped. Well, I read. Let's see. Hey, Nick, read for me. Let's see where I left off. Read 39 and then go through chapter 22, verse 5. So start right here in 21 and go through to 22:5. Yes. Gamaliel. Okay. So Paul gets his wish, and he gets to speak to the people. And I don't know exactly what's going on. I almost pictured an elevated stairway or something, like he gets to get somewhere where everyone can see him. And he starts speaking in Hebrew. And remember, just a few minutes ago, the commander said, "What's going on? Why are you attacking this guy?" And it said, some shouted one thing, some shouted another. The commander couldn't figure out what was going on because it was chaotic. Paul starts speaking in the Hebrew dialect, and what happens? The place goes quiet. So they go from a ridiculous mob to, they're hushed, now they're listening. And Paul gets to make his defense. And so he starts off by, Paul's throwing his Jewish resume out there, isn't he? He says, hey, this is what I am, this is where I'm from, this is what I was all about. And he even throws some good thoughts their way, doesn't he? He even kind of, I don't know what the word is. I mean, he says something nice about them. He says, let's see, in verse 3, I was brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you are today. Paul's pretty good at that, isn't he? He's on Mars Hill and he says, well, I see you guys are very religious. Gets their attention. Were they very religious? Yeah. They're just misguided. Were all these people zealous for God? Yeah. Just misguided, aren't they? And then he starts talking about how he, at one time, persecuted the way. He persecuted the church. He talked about how he was putting them in prison, men and women, how he was really working for the high priest, working for the council, doing all these things. I mean, he was a Jew of Jews. He was doing exactly what they're doing to him right now. He was doing that at one point. This is how Paul's making his argument. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's see. Ken Simeon, would you read for us? Oh, let's see. Read 6 through 11, please. Okay, so Paul starts recounting the story of his conversion, doesn't he? And when you notice, it's, we see this several places in the book of Acts. Not to mention its origin story too, right? So he gets up there and he starts talking about, I was on the way to Damascus, and then a bright light came down around me. I mean, I started throwing up all the different things that Paul said to this Jewish audience, right? I mean, think about this for a minute. So Paul starts talking to this Jewish audience. He's making a defense. And he says, a bright light shined down around me. Now, does that sound like a normal thing? No, that's not normal. It's midday, and yet there's a bright light. So first thing he says was there was a miracle involved here, right? Pretty subtle, but that's what he's saying. And then he says, Jesus, the Nazarene, spoke to me. What does this crowd think about Jesus the Nazarene? Same crowd that killed him. So Paul starts talking about, and it's not just Jesus, it's not just, he doesn't leave it nebulous at all. Jesus the Nazarene. We all know exactly who we're talking about, huh? Crowd keeps listening. And he says, Paul called Jesus Lord. How would the crowd react to that? Jesus the Nazarene? Lord? I don't know, I just find that kind of odd to present that in your defense, and the Jews just quietly listened to that. Well, then we get to the next section. So Jesus tells Paul what to do. Get up and go to Damascus. Now in verse 12. A certain Ananias, a man who was devout by standard of the law, and well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing near said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very time I looked up at him. And he said, The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear an utterance from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now, why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Okay? Very familiar with this passage. All these concepts. And again, Ananias performs a miracle. He opens Paul's eyes. And then he called Jesus God's righteous one. Jews, no reaction yet. If you're a Jew, do you believe in any of these things? I mean, the miracles, okay. All right, great, Paul, you saw some miracles. But now we're talking about Jesus as God's righteous one. God allowed you to hear an utterance from the mouth of the righteous one. Verse 17, it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. Now, what should the Jews make of that? Would this be the stuff? This wouldn't be the story I would be telling, right? I came here to Jerusalem, and I'm preaching to you guys, and the Lord came to me again and said, you got to get out of here. They're not going to listen. Look at what Paul said. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison, beat those who believe in you, and when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by, approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you to the Gentiles. Verse 22 says, they listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were crying out and throwing off their coats and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging so that he might find out the reason why they are shouting against him that way. So Paul keeps going in his defense. He said, this is what Ananias told him to do. Then he saw another vision of Jesus saying to leave Jerusalem. I mean, look at all these things. If you're a Jew at that point and you just drug Paul out of the temple and you were about to kill him by beating him to death, Paul starts telling a story. You sit there and listen to all of that. Stephen's blood was shed. You're just accused of killing an innocent man again. Quiet, we're listening to that part. We get to go to the Gentiles, and then the place erupts. Why didn't they erupt when Paul said, I saw Jesus speaking to me from heaven? They didn't erupt over that. Be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on his name, Jesus' name. They didn't erupt over that. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Early on, he said that. Kind of let that go. As soon as we got to this, though, can't take it anymore. We're going to throw our coats off. Can you just envision, I don't know how many men are there. Let's say there's a couple hundred men there. And they all start throwing dirt in the air, yelling and screaming, away with this guy, we got to kill him. Let's throw dirt in the air. I don't even know how to describe that. Just absolutely unhinged. I mean, I want to say childish, but I don't know. It's far worse than that. Go ahead, Carl. Go ahead, back up. Go ahead. It's all right. Even that, though, that it said they supposed that he brought him in. Yeah. 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 Now, this is not what your main point was, but the last point you made, that always seems to be what Paul falls back to as his defense, huh? I was doing the same thing you were doing, but I found out the truth about Jesus. It's almost like Paul always thinks that is going to persuade them. That is going to turn them and bring them. And maybe it did work to some. That does always seem to be his argument. Now, about whether they knew he was a Jew or not, I think these men know exactly who Paul is, and that's why they hate him so much. They know he was once one of them, and he has completely turned to the way, and that just intensifies their hatred of him. How can the high priest and all the officials of the priesthood not know who he is? And they wanted to cleanse the temple, not because Paul went into the temple, but because they supposed he brought someone else, a Greek, into the temple too. So maybe they're really ignorant of who and what Paul is, but I don't think so. I think they know exactly what and who he is. Yeah, he has. It does seem, though, that they recognized him by sight. The Jews from Asia seem to recognize him. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, I don't know why, I could suppose to, but it does seem to be an incredible tradition of theirs. Someone stands up and starts speaking in the Hebrew dialect. Whoa, all right, we're going to quiet down, let him say his piece. At least he's speaking in Hebrew and not like some barbarian talking in Greek here. They always allow for that defense to be making. And doesn't it always goes back to our forefathers and stuff like that. Boy, they love to sit and listen to that story. And that's how Paul kind of tells the story a little bit. It's so classic. I don't know what you'd call it. Go ahead. Yeah. 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 Place just explodes. So, anyways, let's see. Verse 24, I think I read that. Verse 25. Okay, so the Roman commander pulls him in because the place is exploding again and decides, I'm going to examine him by scourging. That doesn't sound like a fun examination. Verse 25. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, but I was actually born a citizen. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priest and the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Okay, so the commander is still not sure. Why is this man causing such an unbelievable uproar? So we're going to set up another, inquiry here. So he gets the chief priest to come down. He gets Paul to come down. The commander's there. He's got plenty of Roman men there. So he's going to try and get to the bottom of this. Why do these people hate Paul so much? It can't be just because they have a disagreement, right? There's something else is going on here. And he's confused, and he's trying to get to the bottom of it. So, chapter 23. We can go a little bit farther. Let's see. Samuel, would you read, let's see. Let's read 1 through 5 for right now. Okay. I don't know. I love this part. This is pretty comical. So, in the last chapter, we see, how many times have we seen the fact that Paul has Roman citizenship help him out in these situations? Man, time after time. When it finally comes out that he's a Roman citizen, it really gets him out of some hot water many times. And you can see how the Romans treat themselves versus everyone else. I mean, if you're a Roman, you could just grab a Jew and you're like, I want to figure out what's going on. Beat him until I'm sure that he's telling the truth. Woo! That's pretty nasty. But if the guy's a Roman, whoa, we can't even put him in chains. I mean, look at how they're treating each other. And then the Jews, you got the Jews from the other point of view, doing the same thing. They're going to listen to Paul say all these things about Jesus, whom they murdered, and Stephen. But when we get to the point where we say, well, now we can go preach the gospel to the Romans, whoa, can't stand it. Man, these groups hate each other. They really do. So we get to this part. Paul's brought down before the council, and the high priest has someone, in verse 2, the high priest Ananias commanded those beside him to strike him on the mouth. And then I just look at Paul's reaction. Then Paul said, God is going to strike you down, you whitewashed wall. You sit and try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? Was Ananias in the wrong by doing this? Oh yeah. Paul just points it out perfectly. And look at what he called him. I mean, those are fighting words. But then look at Paul's attitude once he finds out who he's speaking to. It's pretty impressive. We'll pick up here next week and keep going.